Hello, everybody. This is me again, and we are going to take a look at the next pair of slides for the next lecture. So, this lecture is called Garden Cities, and it deals with the concept developed by Ebenezer Howard um, in the 19th century. And basically, what Howard is doing is that he's developing an utopian vision of how people should live or could live in these garden cities. Um, and not only he has an idea of the shape and form how people should live in these garden cities, but it's maybe even more important than the design. It's a social utopia where he's envisioning a way of how people can live together. Um, one second. Okay. Okay. So if you remember the last lecture, one of the first slides I showed was about these two different groups of thinkers, two different groups of visionaries, where on the one hand you would have people that were not formally trained as architects or planners, um, that were more inspired by utopian ideas, literature, um, new social utopias, and so on. So obviously, Ebenezer Howard is one of those, and this group was opposed by the other group that was more kind of straightforward planning, believing in the idea that you should have well-trained experts that decide the future, that plan the cities of tomorrow, while the group of which Ebenezer Howard is part, he was more one of those who thought about citizens coming up for themselves, organizing themselves, and finding ways to help themselves. So this is different from the kind of more authoritarian, elitist idea of other people. So let's jump right into it. The idea of the garden cities emerged from a book. Right? It was not a project, not a commission, not a competition. It was a book, and he created this book first under title Tomorrow: Peaceful Path to Real Reform. So that reflects the idea of that social utopia much more than the new title under which it became famous, Garden Cities of Tomorrow. Um, so as I said, these garden cities is his vision of how people can live together as a community in cities that were attached but outside of the bigger cities. Um, and in these new cities that would emerge, he's envisioning that different classes, different income types, different people with different levels of education live and work together and form one community, and as such also help each other. So again, Howard was not trained as a planner or an architect, but he was um, working in different professions. He's worked as a farmer. He was a shorthand writer in the U.S. He British, but he traveled. He spent time in the U.S. And yeah, that's also where he developed the idea of those garden cities. Very much influenced by anarchist ideas of self-help and community. So it starts quite straightforward and simple. If you think of the two kind of dialectic opposites that you have. Either you can live in the town or you can live in the countryside. Um, both of which have pros and cons. What Howard is envisioning is that you could live in something what he calls town country. So this is his new garden city idea that combines all the positive effects of the town, city living, and also the ones of the countryside. So if you look into these um, kind of keywords that he wrote here underneath the term town country, you see the ideals of his social utopia. So on the one hand, you have low rents, but also you have high wages. You would have low prices. You would have no sweating, plenty to do. There's a field for enterprise, but there's also flow of capital, pure air and water, good drainage. As you remember from the first lecture, drainage was a problem. Health conditions were a problem. And the homes were bright and gardens were available, no smoke, no slums. So very, very much idealizing this combination of the best parts of the city and the best parts of the countryside and combining them. So yeah, that's the essence of this diagram of the three magnets. And he was thinking this idea through, right? So there's a couple of steps through which he believes that this garden city idea is actually realizable. So first of all, the garden city, this kind of community, starts from the idea of a company where the industrialists and the workers and their families put their fate together, and as a in the form of a company, a limited dividend company, they develop this new garden city, um, yeah, almost like a company. So the steps are: steps one, first they would borrow the money as a association, as a company. They would borrow the money and buy land to establish a garden city in the countryside. And this is because in the countryside you could buy land relatively cheap, right? So you could, with a relatively small loan, buy a lot of land, and then people could move there. So step two, industrialists move their factories and workers there, and the factory owners and the workers together build then houses and establish the city. So this is quite important because that means that this garden city is self-sufficient in terms of the combination of living and working. You probably remember some of those um, ideas how to tackle overcrowding that we talked about in the last kind of game session, where one of the problem that always tends to reappear is that when establishing a town or city or any kind of housing development, if you don't make sure that there are places to work as well close by, you always get a problem. Either people can, not afford to move there, and then either they're unemployed or they simply leave that settlement and start living somewhere else, potentially again in slums in the city. So okay, in the garden city idea, step two is everybody moves there together and everybody builds together, and once it's done you will have places to work, places to live right next to each other. And then it's also in the countryside, so you will have leisure spaces as well. The third step is that the garden city would have a limit on 32,000 people, and they would live on 1,000 acres, and they would be surrounded by a large permanent green belt. So that's that leisure space that I was talking about. basically means that there's a kind of radial city, and around the city there's a green belt for recreation and agriculture. Let's go to the next one. So this is very abstract diagram, right? And then from here he started developing something that's in fact still an abstract diagram of a city, but much more detailed than those keywords that we've seen before. So here we see that he's thinking about a radial city where you have a very strong center with some public facilities there and a public garden, and streets would all go towards that one point in the center. Around that there would be green spaces, and then there would be housing areas and big avenues going once around the whole development. Again, more housing, and then on the outer ring there would be the industry and the factories, and that would be connected also through either a kind of highway or some waterway. Yeah, so here you see in fact that he was not trained as an architect or designer. Kind of very simple plan, very diagrammatic still. This is kind of the bigger vision, where he thinks of one bigger city in the center. He's thinking of a population of roughly 60,000 people, and then all these bubbles surrounding that bigger city would be different garden cities, each limited to a population of 32,000 people. You would have some basic connections like a highway. There's a municipal canal, what he calls it, so that would be a waterway, and there's also a railway. This one he calls it intermunicipal railway. So in different ways these garden cities are connected one to the next, but also they're all connected to that central city in the middle. The spaces in between are filled as green belts, which basically means they're not filled. There's partially simply nature as you find it, and partially they're used for recreation or agriculture. So that's what should provide the rest space and leisure spaces, green spaces in general. Okay, another diagram of same thing. It's kind of repetitive, I think. So this would be again the central city, roughly 60,000 people, garden cities, 32,000 people, and the different connections among one another and also to the central city. Okay, this one shows how his idea, how can I say, conceptually his idea should extend. It should not only be this one ring with the central city, right? It should be something that spreads over the country and could be endlessly repetitive, theoretically. But Howard never found it necessary to draw that. So this is made by somebody else. I thought it's nice to include this. So if you imagine you have a landscape with some existing towns that could be populated with these garden cities over time, then if you wait long enough you might at some point have this kind of network where you can see again this kind of hierarchy where you have some central cities and then these garden cities kind of revolving around them. And of course things are not as perfectly symmetrical as the ideas of or the diagrams of Howard suggest, because of course in real life you will have topography, locational features of the landscape, existing towns, and so on. So this I think is a nice diagram to illustrate how that type of urbanization could actually work. Okay, right, and this is just to illustrate the idea why it makes sense to build in the countryside. So our thinks that it's a smart strategy to develop the garden city as a community and kind of build together and profit together, because then the community can profit from the land values that are increasing. So what you see here in this top diagram is that you have agricultural land with a certain value that's represented on the y-axis here. So agricultural land is relatively cheap. So if you buy that, or if, sorry, I say it wrong, if this agricultural land is relatively cheap, and then if the municipality changes the land use to any kind of urban program, then the land value increases, and normally that increases a lot. So there are studies for South America that say that land values on average in from different South American countries on average would increase 4 to 5 times. When Seoul developed, there was so much pressure because of the rapid urbanization. Everybody wanted to come to the city and land was scarce, that land values increased 9 to 11 times. So that's tremendous, like, value increase when you make that step from agricultural land to some kind of other use, because the municipality changes the agricultural land to urban land. And normally this value increase goes to whoever owns the land, right? If you're lucky, you own land in the outskirts of an existing city. Rapid urbanization comes, everybody needs to live somewhere, and it's kind of logic that your land will be developed, and it rises in land value tremendously. So normally that is just luck for whoever owns that land, or maybe not only luck, because some people are smart and speculate and start buying land wherever they think it will be developed. But somehow this value normally always goes to one lucky person or one smart person. And yeah, this was kind of Howard's trick, that he would say, okay, this is not about individuals, this is about the group, and the group would buy that land together, forming an association, and then develop the city, and so they would also bring the profit to the land, right, just by inhabiting it and urbanizing it. So it's kind of smart to then also use that land value increase for your own advantage. So just to show you why it is so difficult to develop somewhere where something has already been built, like inside the city or town, then the land value is much higher. And if you have a program there, something with a relatively high value, like commercial, then it's difficult to build anything else, because the commercial land value is already really high. If you then want to build housing in the same area, then in fact you decrease the value of your land, and it's much more difficult to make a profit. Now you would need to build in higher density and so on. You don't have to remember this in detail, but this is just to show, like, why it is smart to use that land value increment for your community when you go from agricultural land to urban land, and why it is so difficult to realize a similar idea inside the city, simply because it's so difficult to make it profitable, and you might even lose money in that transition. Okay, and here it becomes very clear the vision of Howard, how he wants to establish something like self-help. How can I call it? Public public facilities. No, I'm saying it wrong. He wants to create like a social process in which the inhabitants of the city create some kind of social net for each other. So here in this diagram, he's showing how in a normal situation people would inhabit a piece of land, and then monthly you pay fee for rent to your landlord. And now what he's saying is that if you go out to the countryside and develop this agricultural land, then first of all the rents are much cheaper. So if you pay similar if you pay similar price than what you would pay monthly in the city, you can pay off or pay the rent, and on top of that, like pay off the loan you took for the land. So over time, that loan gets smaller, and you can accumulate some kind of wealth, some kind of municipal social fund. And that is what he's trying to establish in these garden cities as well. Not only a place to live that is healthy, clean, and safe, but also kind of a community that takes care of itself. So what you see here is that over time, this kind of municipal fund is taking over. You don't have to pay much rent to the landlord anymore, but people keep paying every month, and from that money you can provide pensions for the people that live there. So that's also something that used to be quite rare, right? Once you stop working, you were mainly dependent on your families, but with this system there would be some kind of social safety net created, and this is not something where you rely on the state, but created by the citizens and for the citizens. So if you want to make a distinction about the kind of prevailing ideas of how you could live at the time, so on the one hand you would have capitalism, and on the other hand kind of centralized socialism, then this one is a new kind of social utopia, or not necessarily new, but different social utopia, where people as a group, as a community, help themselves. So it's not the big centralized socialism for the whole country that you have on the one hand, and not that dog-eat-dog capitalism on the other one. It's more about individual groups, 32,000 people developing, living together, working together. Okay, so from here we go towards design. Idea of garden city is inspired by this one of the early suburban plans by this guy down here, Frederick Law Olmsted, and this suburban plan is the plan for Riverside. If you haven't studied suburban housing before, you probably don't know this project, but most of you will know, for example, Central Park in New York. That's designed by Olmsted, and also the park and the big park in Boston, also designed by him. So he's probably most famous landscape architect at the time, but also working in urban design and urban planning. So this is the plan for Riverside, and you will probably not be surprised when you hear that it's made by a landscape architect. You see all those round shapes, very picturesque, very soft, very smooth corners. Mm, in a way, the housing areas over here, look very much park-like, right? You really see that this is a suburban plan designed by a landscape architect. All these soft, round shapes seem to emerge from the idea of a park and people that are slowly strolling, um, yeah, aimlessly, without a hurry or need to be somewhere quickly. Um, the only thing that is very rational and different in this plan is this straight line that you see here. So this is following the commuter railway line, which is going to Chicago. So this is a suburb of Chicago. The line has been planned by the railway planning, and then all these round fluffy shapes are the work of Olmsted. So you see some elements like there's a lot of green, very soft, but then also a lot of green. Idea of the green belt comes back. But what you don't see here is places for working, right? So that's very different from Howard's idea. So this is not a association of people living and working in the same area, but this is a clear like sleeping town for people that work in Chicago. It reflects in this road plan. I put this in because here you have a couple of institutions where you really have to look for them on this map. So for example, church here, a couple of public institutions here close to the train station, which shows that predominantly this is just housing suburb. Okay, and then if you look at the architecture, in a way it's quite sobering, because the idea of the suburb of the big city in the green area has been something new and revolutionary, and that could have been explored with a new type of architecture, right? If you already create a new typology for living the suburb, then why not create your own architectural typology that goes with that? But somehow, the choices for architecture are quite conservative and historic. If you look at these buildings here close to the train station, or those in the background, not very modern, innovative, or spectacular. So in that sense, with the architecture, the plan of Olmsted is more looking backward than looking forward and trying to be modern. So okay, so now we have talked about Howard's vision. We've talked about his inspiration for like the design. And that's important because it will come back in some projects that we see in a little bit. So now in England, in some way, these ideas have caught on. In some ways, it was also simply a necessity for the bigger cities to spread out and deal with rapid urbanization in terms of suburbanization. So try to relieve the stress on the city and make people um, go out to the suburbs. And yeah, this would become um, a new strategy which would become easier and easier at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, simply because technology is getting better. So all of a sudden you could use trains. Trains make it much more easy, efficient, and cheaper to move people around, right? Not everybody can afford a car. You would have the tram as well, underground railway, all kinds of different trams. um, Combustion engine is emerging as like affordable mass transportation for the masses. You could have buses that move people around. We talked in the last lecture about new policies that would emerge, and with that you would have new agencies, so parts of the city government that would really look for solutions to rapid urbanization, and in that sense also some of these agencies would promote suburban living. Um, and then that you had low cost of housing because of cheap labor and cheap materials. That has something to do with the industrialization process itself. You could provide materials cheaper, and labor was getting cheaper. And there was better planning. So the people that were interested in making the city better and dealing with that problem of congestion, crime, unhealthy situations, and so on, they simply understood the city better. Um, so all these factors led to a new trend um, that was suburbanization, and these suburbs that would emerge also are referred to as garden cities. Um, this one talks about new policies, a new act. You don't have to learn these policies by heart. You don't have to learn what policy exactly, sorry, did what, but it's more about the um, general idea that on different layers um, innovation took place. So then on the regulatory level, you would have new policies that would um, allow, for example, in this act, the LCC, the London County Council, to start building also outside of the boundaries of London itself, which was of course then a push for suburbanization. Different suburbs would emerge out of this. One of the first one is Totterdown Fields, and yeah, um, I show them because in regular language, people in England would refer to this type of suburbs as garden cities, simply because they're new suburbs outside in the green. But this doesn't mean that they have a lot to do with the ideas of Howard and garden cities, and this doesn't mean there's a strong idea of social utopia present. So look, this is, for example, Totterdown Fields. Here, some of the principles of Howard have been like met, but a lot haven't. So let's just take a look. So one thing that did happen is that the LCC took advantage of the cheaper land in the outskirts and the suburbs, converted agricultural land to urban land. And then the idea was to make it affordable for people to work here. Sorry, and make it affordable for workers to live here, and from their wages afford to pay for this house and also the commute to London. So this kind of relation between working and housing was thought through together with the wages. but then it looks much too small, right? You remember, mm, garden cities were planned for 32,000 people. This was planned for, yeah, let's say 8.5, 9,000 people. So much smaller, mm, and also somewhat sober in its architectural expression. Few housing typologies, so a lot of repetition. Um, yeah, you also see in the architecture that again there's the predominating idea of nostalgia, if you want. So this is again not modern new housing for a new kind of living concept. This is more looking backwards, right? So trying to emulate maybe an old barn, or looks like kind of urbanized countryside living. So if you look over here, so in that sense, not very innovative or creative on the architectural level. Yeah, so biggest criticism is that here you wouldn't have the combination of living and working. Also, this was not planned as a association of workers and factory owners together, but it's planned simply as a sleeping town for people that work in London. And then another big criticism is that this would help to deal with the problem of housing, but it would not provide housing for the poorest. So that also we saw in our game experiment, which was something difficult for all kind of policies to achieve. Okay, so this was Totterdown Fields, second slide of the same thing. So here again you see housing typology, yeah, kind of romanticizing countryside living, creating all these little corners, um, and making this trying to break up this long row housing into different small elements, to make it appear more countryside-like and small and cute. Okay, so from here, um, talk a little bit about transportation planning, because there was a big impact. Um, so now you have new trains that are that have the potential to bring people towards London from places further away than where people would live before, simply because they can now afford and reach London on time. Um, and that is symbolized in this diagram, right? So it's like this octopus collecting people in the suburbs, and then this is the showing the density of passengers, collecting the passengers in the morning from all the suburbs to go into London. Um, yeah, so that has to be planned together: housing, land, and the places of work in the city. So there was this one guy from the US who understood this pretty well, um, but different from Howard, he was trying to exploit this system for his own gain. And I wanted to include this here because in a way it's very smart, though it's not built to help the community or improve the way people live, but simply trying to make a profit from this. So this person is called Jerks, and he came over from the US, and when he arrived in London, he started to acquire part of the London Underground network, different tram feeder lines, basically buying up pieces of the underground and train network, and then started to extend them. And he understood very well that relation between the shift from agricultural to urban land and the importance of um, living and working, that they have to be connected somehow if they are not close to each other. So what he did is that he would invest tremendous amounts of money mm, into those underground lines and train lines and the infrastructure, and then at the same time he would invest even more money into buying land that is close to those train lines. And in fact, he would make a loss from the from the trains, but then he would plan the train stations at points where he would own the land, which he would develop and make a big fortune from developing the land, and in the end, recover his costs and losses that he had purely from the transportation. Um, yeah, recover it and make a big profit on top of that. Um, so this is, what happens if you leave it to private parties to develop this. It can still go both ways. You cannot really say that it's better if private people develop the land outside and the suburbs, because it can either be something for the community or that association of people that develops together, what Howard envisions, but private development can also take shape as this one, which is purely about exploitation and profit making. Okay, so here you would see a diagram of the train line going over here, and then almost like leaves on a tree or on a branch. There would be like one suburb after the other emerging around those train lines. And it's kind of interesting if you look here also, still you would have something like a green belt around, like green spaces. So there's this small or medium-sized town, suburb, and then there would be green spaces separating one of those developments from another. Here you see a plan of Letchworth. This is one of the more famous so-called garden cities that have been developed by Raymond Unwin and Barry Parker, two famous British architects at the time. And they won a competition for the design of Letchworth, and this is what they came up with. So they wanted to make something that was picturesque, somewhat traditional British, traditional English, and apply that to this new typology of suburb or garden city, as they call it then. And now I'm trying to simply show like what elements are left of the idea of Howard. So first of all, maybe you recognize that centralized plan. All streets are going to the center, and that's where also the social center, commercial center of that suburb is. Also here you would have the train station on the outside, and you would have something like a green belt around, maybe a little bit further. Interestingly, you see that there's already a plan in place. Sorry, in place how this garden city could extend. So this reminds us of the Hobrecht plan, what we've learned in first lecture about Berlin. There's already an idea of future city extension in place that will make it more efficient and easy to operate. The factories are also outside, similar to the garden city idea. Only here they are placed only in the east, so that probably also has something to do with the direction of the winds. If the wind is predominantly coming from the west towards the east, then all the pollution will be carried away. That might be the reason why it's not wrapping around the industrial belt. Then if we go on the next scale level, here we see one urban block, and yeah, here you can clearly see that those were architects making the plan. So in principle, it's a parameter block. You have the outer side defined by the roads, and then you have the houses on the perimeter of the block. It's somewhat porous. There are openings that let you like go inside, but pretty much the houses are forming like a one continuous barrier in order to keep it a little bit light and less oppressing. They shift facades a little bit, but in a way this is like a broken perimeter block. And then inside you have more perimeter blocks, and for the private and public spaces normally you would have a little front yard, then the house, and then a bigger backyard. So that would be your private space. And what is exceptional in this plan, and I believe also one of the reasons why this became popular, are these spaces that you have here. So all these numbers are standing for different communal spaces. Could only find a German example, but can explain or translate quickly for you. So these would be spaces for facilities like one is undefined institute plan. Oh, that's on the outside. So number two, this would be like tenement gardens where you could grow your own vegetables if you want. But then you would also have more fancy spaces like bowling green. Yeah. Number five is tennis courts. And then there's some kind of lawn over here. But especially if you look at bowling green or tennis courts, this is not something that people from the lower middle class or middle class could afford at the time, right? So here they're trying to take advantage of community as well on a different level than Howard did, right? Howard thought about how to create pensions for the people living together. They are trying to find ways in which you can give a little bit more luxury or pleasure to the people living here together by giving them these communal spaces with facilities that they could not afford if they would have to pay for it by themselves. Sorry. I think these points I already talked about, some resemblance to Howard's ideas, but then also pretty different. Here again you can see that romanticization of countryside living in the design of the streets, also in the design of the architecture. Very green, very rural, slow, yeah, not trying to embrace the new and the modern, as we will see in other lectures. They also, or Raymond Unwin, one of the two architects, wrote a book that drew attention back then, and this was kind of a guideline for other architects how to design this type of neighborhood. You don't have to remember the details. This is more about showing how by trying to be technically really precise, like in the details, how to design it, how to develop it, what is the distance between two houses, 70 feet, what is the density per acre, how much garden does every family have, and all these things. Of course, good, but somehow in this trajectory, the big idea, the big social utopia, that how it has gets lost. Here again, you see studies comparing different types of layouts. And one thing that I appreciate, we don't have to go into details, but here architects and the urban designer were not only making the spatial design, but thinking also about these important elements such as investment, how much density do you have to build to make a scheme feasible, and so on, something that we've lost a little bit today in architecture education. And then these are more examples. Yeah, some of them look quite sober for me, in my opinion. It's kind of streets or the backsides too repetitive and sober, but that's maybe personal opinion. Then Unwin was asked to build more of this kind of developments. So another famous one from him is called Hampstead, and this is this development, and you see how also in terms of compactness he's going further and further away from the ideas of Howard. So now the compact shape, round shape, with a centralized center for the economic and institutional activities is not there anymore. Now it looks like a real, like kind of spread suburb, right? So he's more thinking about the space now and how the buildings integrate into the landscape. That's what you see here. So roads and location and direction of the buildings is more following the idea of the topography rather than a kind of superimposed diagram. So that you see here, then you see those kind of typical streets on a sunny day, still popular today. So yeah, you see the attention for detail in this plan. Urban design in a way much more refined and in that sense better. He's introducing some elements that we didn't know or haven't seen before in suburban design, like the cul-de-sac, the dead-end street. So that simply means now traffic is getting stronger, and this is an area mainly for living. So an easy tool to make a street safe is simply to not let it connect to anything else, right? So the people that need to go somewhere else don't bother coming into your dead-end road, they will just continue. So it can avoid a lot of traffic there. In fact, that is what's being done in the Korean apartment dungeons as well, right? Big area, but then only 2 or 3 entrances to the dungeon, so you also avoid the through traffic. Okay, here you can also see how there's the relation with the topography and the directions of the buildings and the routing of the roads, still following the perimeter of the block. Yeah, and in some way you remember from Letchworth that this kind of perimeter block was broken open, frequent openings between the buildings where you could go inside. So this plan looks much more stiff if you want. One of the reasons is that these blocks were designed, how can I say, he would normally design the corners in here, and if you look at the plan of Letchworth, normally the lines would be open and the lines would be closed and the corners would be open. So this gives a different kind of appearance to the plan and makes this one, if you use the corners, you define the shape much more, but you also make the plan more static. Okay, another example. I like this mainly as a design drawing. I think we've seen all of this before in pictures. I like this way of designing where you have a road plan, then you have a section with an integrated perspective, and then another perspective for showing the look and feel, and another one for like a detail, how a path in the road intersect. But in fact, with these 4 drawings, maybe even only with these 3, you give a pretty good explanation of how you design that road. And this is already done more than 100 years ago. Yeah, this is also just to show the level of detail that Unwin was going through in order to design those plans. So how do different streets intersect, and what's the middle of the road, and what's your perspective, and how does that work? You see also quite classical examples that he's using, or the central perspective in a big building, breaking your view. So still somewhat historicizing, not radically modern. And you see that back in the whole architecture, urban layout, and so on. I like this perspective because it shows from the top how you have a suburb, and then you have a green belt around, then there's the next suburb, green belt, and how this pattern repeats in the landscape, and actually becomes part of the typical English landscape today. Okay. So this is the important part of the lecture. I will add, I will add a little bit of a look backwards about traditional British landscape design before I finish, simply to give you an idea about how that picturesque design method works, because I think it's good to know about that. It's still valid today, and if you don't get introduced to it, you probably miss something. So this is a famous British park. Sorry, one thing I have to say, okay, of course, some of these principles are repeated, right, in the work of Unwin, Parker, this kind of historicizing vision of looking back. When you think about this, it's very much about lines of sight and some elements that you will recognize from this picturesque design technique that they employ here in Stourhead. So this is design of a landscape park, which looks very nature-like, but in fact this is not nature, this is all designed. What is kind of interesting is that this idea of the park is to bring you away from the troubles of modern life, if you want, and bring you back to nature with some like incidental urban elements or city architectural elements. So one thing that you always see in these British landscape designs is that you have outside of the park big trees. It's almost like creating a curtain on the background that blocks out anything that is happening behind. And then you have a very distinctively designed route, and also lines of sight, like vision. So, for example, this building is absolutely designed, this bridge is absolutely designed. We'll talk about that more later. So picturesque, it's called because it's based on the idea of pictures, specifically French landscape painters, and in those paintings you always find elements of urban life and nature somehow combined in harmony together. So what you would see here are different like scenes that always consist of urban elements and natural elements. So these are examples from Lorrain, and that idea was taken up in the design of parks, for example, Stourhead. So here you see a layout of the plan with a big lake in the center. Then you have these different elements, right? So one building here, one building there, and these lines of sight. So when you walk around that park, you would have different moments where you can see certain perspective, which is like framing a view, just resembling these kind of scenes in a historic landscape painting. It's quite amazing way of designing. So when you walk around that park, following that track, in fact, it's almost like seeing different scenes that, if you combine them, create a narrative, create a story. So that would be the way of entertaining, educated people walking through the park and at the same time kind of reliving scenes in a narrative while walking. So here you see another picture of the same thing, right? Also the romanticization of the countryside, together with some architectural elements, which are also there mainly either for the scene or for decoration. This, for example, that building is called Folly. If you don't know what a folly is, Folly means a building without function, building without program. Right? We are so programmed to always like design for a certain program, but in this English landscape architecture, they didn't care about the program. So this building's function is there to look good from this perspective, right, where the picture is taken. And none of what you see here is incidental. The background is consisting of trees that have been grown for the purpose of creating that backdrop. That lake is changed, that hill is artificial, the lake part of it is artificial to create this beautiful reflection pond. And so everything here is designed, even though it looks very kind of soft, natural, and soft and natural, and actually it looks undesigned. Maybe that's one of the good features of good design. You don't really see that it's designed anymore. Okay, because I was talking so much about the historicizing in the architecture of Unwin and Parker, I thought it's good to show you like one short example of this British landscape design. And with that, I think I'm already at the last slide. So now coming back to the ideas of Howard, Garden City idea of group, community, developing together, benefiting together, developing a city with working and living in the countryside, which he called Garden City, how that developed in a new, different type of Garden City once it's been carried out, where the Garden City was predominantly a place to sleep, like a suburb, and then people would work somewhere else. So these suburbs were mainly for the lower middle class, and maybe even upper middle class, but seldomly were they affordable for the poorest. So often the poorest would just remain in the big city. Um, yeah, so there's quite a lot of discrepancy between the two. How can I say, like the ideal of Howard and how it's been carried out in the implementation of Unwin Parker, and in the process, ironically, it left or forgot about its kind of socio-economic ideal that was behind it. Okay, so this is the end. Some of these ideas will come back in other lectures, specifically Howard's Garden City. So yeah, don't forget, and I will talk to you more in the next session. Thank you.